Opening the center immediately invites tactical skirmishes and develops a central pawn for active play. Mirroring the center sets up an immediate pawn duel and opens diagonals for rapid piece development. Pawning the king's flank opens lines for the knight, immediately challenging black's central pawn and preparing to castle. Developing a knight to defend the pawn and prepare for central skirmishes, this establishes a solid and flexible foundation for black's game. Introducing immediate pressure on the knight, this bishop redeployment sets up early tactical possibilities and influences black's pawn structure development. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn push immediately questions white's setup and prepares to clarify the central pawn structure. Preserving the bishop's diagonal presence here avoids immediate pawn concession and maintains flexible development options. Developing the knight to its natural square here liberates the queen and prepares to castle, actively contesting white's central influence. Securing the monarch preemptively opens avenues for piece development and counterplay. Solidifying the center and preparing for castling ensures king safety and harmonious piece development. Reinforcing the central pawn and preparing to push it forward, white subtly contests the e-file, a quiet but important preparatory maneuver to potentially support a future d4 advance or consolidate pressure. A bold territorial assertion, sacrificing a tempo to challenge the bishop's position and gain crucial queenside space. However, it does create slight weaknesses around the king. The bishop retreats, preserving its influence and setting up a potential kingside attack later, while preventing black from immediately dislodging it and gaining crucial central space. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for central expansion, this move initiates a strategic battle for control over the d5 square, aiming to blunt white's bishop and reinforce black's queenside presence. Reinforcing the d4 square becomes paramount, preparing for a potential central pawn thrust and providing a stable foundation for the bishop on c2 later. Castling into safety, black fortifies the king and prepares for potential central pawn pushes. Solidifying the kingside and preventing any immediate knight jumps into g4 or f5, this move is a prophylactic measure, a quiet statement of intent to build steadily. 140 characters. Aggressively challenging the bishop's position, this maneuver prepares to liberate the queenside pawn structure and potentially disrupt white's central control. Retreating the bishop to c2 is a prudent repositioning, aiming to solidify the kingside defense and prepare for potential central pawn advances. It also aims to avoid the pin from black's knight on a5 and subtly supports a d4 push later. Aggressively challenging white's central pawn structure, this thrust instantly reconfigures the battlefield, aiming to undermine white's pawn chain and unlock black's queenside play. It creates immediate tension and forces white to decide whether to reinforce or to allow black to gain spatial concessions, potentially leading to a more dynamic middle game. Opening the center now, white actively challenges black's pawn chain and seeks to create dynamic play, potentially liberating their pieces from the back rank and aiming to disrupt black's central control. Unlocking the queen's potential from its central post, this maneuver prepares for a potential queenside expansion and simultaneously bolsters the e5 pawn, creating a more robust pawn chain that resists white's central ambitions. This development, aiming to reroute the knight to a more central outpost or to support a kingside pawn push, subtly reinforces white's queenside space advantage while preparing for potential pawn advances like d5 or c4, aiming to control key central squares and restrict black's pieces. Re-establishing piece coordination, black brings the knight back to its original square, a wise decision given the cramped position it occupied on the queenside, now allowing for a more fluid defense and potential future queenside expansion. White liberates the d-file, potentially activating the rook for future play along that open line and challenging black's central pawn structure by forcing a capture or a pawn advance. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the central files beautifully, allowing your queen a more active role and potentially unburdening the e-pawn for future advances. However, be mindful of the slightly isolated pawn structure this creates on the queenside, which could become a target later. The knight's journey to f1 is a patient repositioning, aiming to redeploy via g3 or h2 to bolster the kingside or support a central pawn push later, demonstrating a commitment to a slower, more strategic buildup rather than immediate fireworks. Bringing the bishop to d6 immediately shores up the e7 bishop's position and prepares for potential pawn breaks with c4, aiming to gain central influence and dislodge white's knight from f1, which currently looks a bit misplaced after its journey. Activating the knight towards the kingside, aiming to create an outpost on g6 or f5, while simultaneously preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm or piece maneuver. Black is aiming to reroute the knight, seeking a more active post and potentially reinforcing the d6 bishop's defense. The piece on a5 was somewhat out of play, and this maneuver could lead to better central influence, perhaps preparing to challenge white's pawn structure or offer support to future pawn pushes. It's a patient repositioning, prioritizing long-term positional improvement over immediate threats, allowing white to continue building their own structure while black reorganizes. Unveiling a potent attacking intention, this maneuver cleverly reroutes the queen to a square where it supports the knight's eventual advance and simultaneously eyes the kingside, preparing for a potential storm against black's uncastled monarch. Reinforcing the d-file with the rook signifies black's intention to exert pressure and potentially challenge white's central pawn structure, hinting at a potential pawn breakthrough or tactical skirmish down that crucial corridor. Initiating a strategic repositioning, knight aims to bypass the crowded central action and infiltrate a more active diagonal, potentially targeting squares like g4 or f5 to pressure black's kingside defenses or disrupt their pawn structure. A proactive maneuver, the queen embarks on a journey to the queenside, seeking fresh avenues for influence and potentially bolstering the d6 pawn's defense. The knight's bold sidestep to g4 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create attacking opportunities around the kingside, while simultaneously freeing the f1 square for further piece repositioning. Sacrificing the pawn's safety for immediate piece activity looks like a bold gamble here. Opening the h-file immediately challenges black's central control, offering a direct assault on the king's vicinity once white's knight repositions. Introducing a knight to a more active central outpost, the black knight boldly aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the opened g-file, preparing for further central advancement. Unleashing the knight to its most aggressive outpost, this move eyes the f5 square with predatory intent, creating immediate discomfort for black's kingside pawn structure and demanding a precise response from the opponent. Solidifying the bishop's presence on a potentially advantageous diagonal, this placement prepares to challenge white's queenside initiative while creating a robust defensive screen for the king. Unleashing a pawn storm toward the black king, white aims to pry open the kingside and create attacking avenues where none previously existed, significantly expanding the board's pressure. Securing the bishop's retreat to a more active diagonal offers a vital repositioning, simultaneously bolstering the central pawn chain and preparing to contest the open d-file. A quiet repositioning, b3 aims to reinforce the pawn chain and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside or central expansion, while also offering a more robust defense for the white king. Suddenly, the queenside advances aggressively, disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn chain and demanding attention. Repositioning the rook to the open d-file is a crucial step in establishing control over that vital highway, aiming to challenge black's kings, flank indirectly, and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside. Exchanging the rook on the d-file dissolves central pawn tension and clarifies the queenside pawn structure, potentially opening avenues for the light-squared bishop on c7. The exchange of rooks on the d-file finally settles some of the previously fluid action, aiming to consolidate white's nascent central influence. Re-establishing control over the open d-file becomes paramount for black, aiming to coordinate pieces like the knight on g6 and bishop on e6 against white's potentially exposed king and the looming d-pawn. Pushing the g-pawn now attempts to destabilize black's pawn structure on the kingside, potentially creating weaknesses for future attack, or, conversely, solidifying white's own position by gaining a bit more space. Trading the last rooks opens a fresh strategic chapter, shifting focus to piece activity and the critical central pawns. Opening the queen to the d-file now directly contests black's isolated rook and offers a clear path for white's remaining pieces to activate, potentially leading to decisive pressure on the queenside pawns, which are now somewhat exposed. The queen's redeployment to c6 now actively pressures the c3 pawn, forcing white to defend it and potentially creating weaknesses in the pawn structure. Opening the queenside pawn wall with that pawn push directly challenges black's pawn chain and aims to exploit potential weaknesses on the queenside, creating attacking chances where before there was solidity. Prioritizing safety, black shifts the king to a more sheltered square, away from any potential open files or attacking lines that white might try to create. Opening up the queenside with K1 seeks to immediately exploit the now isolated c4 pawn by threatening a discovered attack on the b5 pawn should it move to advance. This also repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting potential queenside expansion or even a future kingside push depending on black's response. A calculated retreat to bolster the bishop's influence on the long diagonal and prepare for potential advances on the queenside, aiming to contest the openness of the c-file. Shifting the queen to the attacking diagonal disrupts black's tentative pawn structure and prepares a swift assault on the weakened kingside. Relocating the king to g8 strategically solidifies its position against white's potential queenside penetration and prepares for any necessary defensive maneuvers by creating an escape square, while simultaneously avoiding the immediate check and allowing black to reassess the developing positional pressures. Opening the file creates an immediate dynamic, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and offering white's queen improved access to the kingside. Finally, a clear path opens for the queen to actively participate, immediately challenging the pawn chain and forcing white to address the newly created weaknesses on the queenside. Unleashing a powerful queen sortie, white immediately threatens the vulnerable black pawn structure with a clever flanking maneuver, aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially open lines towards the king. Solidifying the queenside, this maneuver aims to establish a robust pawn chain and potentially prepare for further queenside expansion, or at least deny white any easy entry points like b6. Securing the king from potential skirmishes on the kingside begins now, a prudent step as the pawn structure thins. Liberating the queen from its somewhat passive post on the queenside, this maneuver aims to stir up complications by placing the monarch under immediate observation. Unlocking the queenside pressure through that pawn thrust creates immediate tension along the 7th rank, forcing black to reassess their defensive structure. The queenside expansion is halted as black shores up the defense of the c4 pawn, aiming to consolidate the position rather than chase further imbalances on the periphery. This judicious regrouping signifies a shift towards stabilizing the structure before considering any counterplay. Focusing on the queenside pawn structure, white aims to disrupt black's defensive setup by potentially creating weaknesses with this aggressive queenside advance. Relocating the bishop to c8 is a defensive maneuver, preparing to contest the c-file should white's queen venture too far down it, and simultaneously offering a potential exchange to alleviate pressure on black's queenside, though it does abandon the defense of the b5 pawn for the moment. Unlocking a potential outpost on d6, this bishop repositioning aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside, subtly shifting the balance from mere pawn tension to a more active positional struggle by enhancing piece coordination. The bishop retreats, sacrificing vital central space and conceding the initiative to white's imposing queen and rook battery. Pivoting the bishop to e3 finally wrests control of the central dark squares, allowing white to eye potential breakthroughs on the kingside while solidifying the pawn structure against further queenside infiltration. Returning the bishop to its protective square, dark aims to reinforce its pawn chain and prepare for potential queenside expansion or a regrouping maneuver. The position is a complex strategic battle. White's queenside pawns are advanced, creating space, but the pawn structure around the white king feels somewhat vulnerable to infiltration. Meanwhile, black has managed to consolidate its pieces, with the bishop on c7 ready to influence the queenside or retreat if necessary. The recent exchange of rooks has simplified the position somewhat, but subtle positional advantages are still very much up for grabs. White will need to be careful not to overextend on the queenside, while black must find a way to activate its pieces effectively and avoid being passively squeezed. The knight on g6 for black is a bit awkwardly placed, but can potentially shift to f8 or h8 for better defense or redeployment. A prudent retreat, the monarch seeks refuge from the looming diagonals, solidifying his position before any immediate threats materialize. Initiating a maneuver to reinforce the pawn chain, black seeks to bolster their central structure and prepare for potential pawn advancements, potentially aiming to create a more solid defensive bastion against white's bishop pair's influence. A bold bid to seize initiative, forcing a repositioning of black's powerful bishop. The bishop's retreat to c8 seems to be a desperate attempt to consolidate defensive resources, but it surrenders crucial squares and leaves the queenside exposed to white's advancing pawns and attacking queen. Consolidating the king's safety is paramount as the queens have been exchanged, transitioning the game toward a more strategic positional battle where king exposure can be fatal. This repeated repositioning of the monarch underscores a desire for a secure retreat. Black is finally reinforcing the cramped light-squared bishop, offering it a slightly more active diagonal and preparing to redeploy the queen. The monarch retreats to safety, seeking a less exposed square as the queens dance around the board, a strategic ballet that has yet to find its decisive step. A curious sidestep, rerouting the bishop back to its previous square after a prolonged dance of positional maneuvering, seems to be a subtle hint at a desire to solidify defenses or perhaps await a more opportune moment to engage, effectively creating a stalemate of pieces with little immediate prospect for significant material gain or strategic breakthrough. Recognizing the stalemate, white decides to break the mirror symmetry of the position by repositioning the queen to a more active square, seeking to exploit any potential weaknesses that black's static structure might present in the upcoming phases of the game. Reshuffling the bishop to e6 aims to solidify the queenside and prepare for a potential central break, but it risks letting white's queenside pawns advance further without sufficient support, creating long-term structural weaknesses. The king's repositioning suggests a cautious approach, perhaps to escape potential threats on the first rank or to better support queenside operations that have been somewhat stalled. Black's knights are conspicuously absent from the action, leaving the queenside vulnerable to white's encroaching pieces and the threat of a kingside breakthrough. Unlocking the queenside with the pawn push finally injects some dynamism, seeking to disrupt black's seemingly solidified position. The bishop's repositioning offers a subtle attempt to fortify the queenside and potentially launch a more aggressive push with the c-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's solid structure. Clearing that central pawn opens a diagonal for your queen and potentially clears a path for your rook if it ever decides to get involved again, creating a more dynamic position. Finally, black seizes the opportunity to snatch a pawn, but this seemingly simple capture opens up the c-file for white's bishop, creating a dynamic tension that will demand careful maneuvering to avoid a material imbalance or positional disadvantage. Challenging the pawn structure on the queenside, white aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially open lines for their bishop. Exchanging the bishop for the knight on d3 opens up a clear pathway for white's queen and king to become more active, potentially creating threats on the kingside. Black's central pawn structure, once fortified, now has a weakness on the d-file that white might exploit. The queen's repositioning now aims to exploit the isolated pawn on the queenside, forcing black to make concessions in the pawn structure to defend it. Reactivating the king's central presence now allows it to escape the wing and potentially participate in the pawn endgame that's rapidly approaching, aiming to become an active attacking piece rather than a passive defender. Exploring the diagonal, the queen aims to reassess its influence, seeking a better vantage point to coordinate with the rooks and potentially exploit any weaknesses in black's pawn structure or king's safety should the opportunity arise. A daring regrouping, seeking to untangle the cramped queenside and activate the queen for potential counterplay, though it might expose weaknesses if white can quickly exploit the freed-up d-file. Focusing on recapturing the pawn on d6, white aims to simplify the position and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise from the ensuing pawn exchanges. The repositioning of the queen to c6 aims to exploit the open c-file, eyeing potential disruptions along it, and perhaps setting up a future knight hop to c4. Reclaiming the initiative, white eyes the vulnerable kingside pawn structure after black's persistent pawn advances on the queenside. Consolidating the king's safety on the g-file provides a welcome respite from the constant pressure along the queenside, creating a more solid defensive structure before any potential pawn advances are considered. Reshaping the queenside pawn structure with the queen creates a subtle threat to capture the isolated pawns on the queenside, forcing a defensive reaction. Exploring an avenue to awaken the slumbering queenside potential, this maneuver aims to redeploy the queen, perhaps eyeing a more active square or preparing for a pawn advancement that could pry open lines for the rook. The king cautiously steps aside, creating a subtle escape route should any tactical complications arise from black's increasingly passive queen. Re-engaging the queenside, black aims to disrupt white's slightly cramped position and potentially activate the inactive light-squared bishop. Reasserting pressure on the queenside, this move aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around their king, while also preparing to advance the c-pawn. An attempt to re-centralize the queen, seeking better squares, though the pawn structure on the queenside remains a significant weakness. Relocating the monarch to a more secure corner of the board appears to be the immediate priority, untangling it from the potentially exposed central ranks, and preparing for any future complications that might arise from this rather static position. Shifting the bishop to b8 aims to support the pawn chain and prepare for potential advances on the queenside, perhaps a b4 push to gain queenside space and activate the rook. This move reshapes the queenside, aiming to isolate the black bishop and potentially create weaknesses. The bishop's repositioning now aims to secure a more robust outpost on the queenside, potentially eyeing further territorial gains and offering better support for any upcoming pawn advances, a crucial step in this slowly developing positional struggle. Repositioning the queen to a more active square, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and probe for weaknesses, hinting at a potential breakthrough that will test the resolve of black's kingside. The bishop retreats, seeking refuge on b8, a passive square that does little to contest white's growing queenside advantage. Black seems content to mirror white's maneuvers, a recipe for a slow positional strangulation rather than an active defense. This cautious dance allows white to consolidate and prepare for a decisive pawn push. The bishop's passive retreat to b8 offers no resistance to white's intended queenside expansion, a missed opportunity for black to actively contest the queenside or exploit white's slightly uncoordinated pieces. The bishop retreats to c7, a defensive posture that feels more like a waiting game than a decisive maneuver, as the players seem to be caught in a loop of checking and retreating, perhaps signaling a mutual reluctance to break the symmetry or reveal their true intentions. The queen now anchors itself, a watchful sentinel eyeing the weak pawn on b5, while simultaneously preparing to sweep across the board to potentially harass black's isolated pieces. Initiating a long-awaited knight maneuver, the black horse embarks on a journey from f8, seeking to reposition and potentially engage on the kingside or aid in defending the light squares. A bold attempt to sever the bishop's defensive post, though it creates a temporary weakness on the d-file that needs careful monitoring. Sacrificing the bishop for the pawn opens up the queen's powerful influence along the a-file, potentially creating immediate threats and forcing white into a defensive posture. A tactical oversight, sacrificing a valuable piece without adequate compensation, opens a direct path for black's remaining forces to exploit the weakened queenside. The knight's relocation to the 6th rank immediately eyes the exposed white king, preparing a potential foray into enemy territory while simultaneously bolstering the central pawn structure. Unleashing a sudden check, white disrupts black's defensive setup and forces a tactical reassessment of the board's geometry, potentially simplifying the position into a more favorable endgame scenario for white's queen and knight coordination. Challenging the queen's influence and seeking to redistribute forces, black offers a tactical gamble. Seizing the initiative, the queen boldly ventures onto the queenside, directly challenging black's pawn structure and forcing a defensive reshuffle. Sacrificing the knight this way feels like a desperate gamble, hoping to reignite activity on the queenside when the king remains exposed and the pawn structure is compromised. Recapturing on e5 immediately addresses the tactical threat and simplifies the material, steering towards a potentially decisive endgame where your remaining pieces can be coordinated more effectively against the isolated g-pawn. Reactivating the knight to the active central square opens up possibilities for counterplay and defends against white's potential pawn pushes. Activating the knight to d4 now allows white to contest the control of the central squares and prepares for a potential breakthrough or exchange that could simplify the position into a favorable endgame for white, leveraging the active queen and rook. Shifting the knight to the queenside pawn storm allows black to potentially create counterplay, though it leaves the king slightly exposed with the defender out of position. Recapturing on c4 reignites the central pawn structure and opens a path for the queen to exert more pressure on the queenside, potentially setting up a decisive endgame advantage. The knight's repositioning to g6 aims to secure the e5 square and potentially join an attack on the kingside, but it surrenders valuable central control and allows white's pawn to advance unimpeded. Asserting central influence, the queen dances forward, ready to exploit any weakness in black's slightly cramped queenside structure, particularly the vulnerable c4 pawn. Seeking to exploit white's potentially exposed king by shifting the queen to a more active central post. Injecting activity into the knight's central presence, the white knight repositions to f5, immediately eyeing weaknesses around black's king and supporting potential pawn pushes.